There aren't a lot of civilians in this world who have personally been inside a nuclear-powered submarine while it dove down to fantastic depths through liquid space. Well, unless they were at Disneyland, of course. Okay, so maybe the Disneyland submarine voyage wasn't actually powered by nuclear energy, but it's this suspension of disbelief that allowed park guests to play along as these gargantuan aluminum ride vehicles meandered their way around the submarine lagoon. In fact, they still do. And lucky enough, the Finding Nemo Submarine Voyage doesn't look all that different from the original submarine voyage, which opened at Disneyland in June of 1959. So, where did the idea of this attraction surface? Well, original plans for the construction of Tomorrowland in 1955 were said to have included a glass-bottom boat ride where guests on board could look down and see all kinds of aquatic life. Real aquatic life. But the tight constraints of the budget for the park didn't allow for the construction of the ride. In 1958, just 3 years after Walt opened this little park in Anaheim, California, Walt Disney and his Imagineers once again took a look at how they could improve the park. Their eyes were dead set on Tomorrowland being the key area for expansion. Imagineer Roger Broggie had told Walt that actor Truman Woodworth had offhandedly remarked that Walt's got everything here except for a submarine. Walt had apparently carried this thought in his head when he entered the meeting where Imagineers discussed bringing the boat ride to the front burner. Walt had responded, "No, let's do a real submarine ride. Let's take them down and give them ports to look out of." And honestly, that's how the submarine voyage was conceived. Dick Irvine, who was the head of WED Imagineering, had assigned a team of creative minds to work on the project, giving Claude Coates and Bob Sewell the job of the overall design, then tasking Bill Martin to create the track layout, and finally, Bob Gurr would design the submarines with help from the company General Dynamics Corp., which just so happened to be the same company that built the world's first nuclear-powered submarines for the United States Navy. Walt's good friend, former naval architect Admiral Joe Fowler, would oversee the construction of the project, as he had overseen the construction of Disneyland 3 years prior. And lastly, Irvine had put Imagineers Roger Broggie and Wathel Rogers in charge of creating animated figures to populate the attraction. Walt insisted that the submarines look realistic. His instructions for Bob Gurr was to design something that resembled the modern submarine counterparts in the Navy, but were much safer for guests to ride. Originally, Bob had wondered about creating an underwater cable system kind of like the cable cars of San Francisco, but he already ran into problems when the city of Anaheim was having difficulty trying to create ordinances that allowed for the operation of underwater vessels, being that the city was located far inland and never had to contend with underwater craft. The city had decided that they would not allow the construction of a watercraft that could fully submerge. Bob went back to the drawing board, and what he came up with was basically considered a boat. The vehicle would not be capable of submerging. Instead, it would always remain at the same waterline and was firmly anchored to the track system. The track would also not provide any propulsion for the vehicle. Instead, he devised a way to install a diesel-electric propulsion system that would drive a large propeller at the rear of the vessel. When it came time to find someone to manufacture the 8 submarines for Disneyland, the United States Navy offered to construct them. This was likely because of the connection with Admiral Joe Fowler. However, Fowler realized that there would be too much red tape and paperwork involved in letting the Navy construct the ride vehicles. So Fowler hired Todd Shipyards in San Pedro, California. These shipbuilders had previously been hired to construct the hull of the Mark Twain riverboat and the hull of the sailing ship Columbia. It would end up costing around $80,625 per submarine. The vessels would span 52 feet in length, 6 feet in width, and could accommodate 38 passengers each. And because the submarines didn't actually submerge, there was room to install a small ventilation system that could constantly bring fresh air from outside and pump it into the cabin. The vehicles could be piloted by a single cast member standing on a small platform and peeking out of the portholes in the conning tower. When the vehicles had finished basic construction, they were transported on flatbed truck to Disneyland and placed one by one in the Disneyland Naval Shipyard, which was basically a concrete dry dock pit dug into the ground for servicing the submarines. From there, the vehicles had their interiors finished and the exteriors painted. The color of the outside was a dull gray color to imitate the real-life submarine counterparts. Meanwhile, work began on draining the Tomorrowland Lagoon and digging it out to further create the lagoon and ride path of the submarine voyage. Plans for the ride show included a network of underwater sets. Thanks to the fact that the submarines were mostly underwater, the show building didn't need to be very tall. In fact, it was short enough that the reworked Tomorrowland Autopia and the newly constructed Fantasyland Autopia were able to have roadways that snaked through the landscape above the show building. And further adding to that layering effect that Walt loved was the fact that the monorail glided through the air above the submarines and the Autopias, effectively making efficient use of the space in this corner of the park. When it came to creating the cast of 126 pneumatically powered animated figures and 180 static figures, Roger Broggie and Wathel Rogers had their hands full leading the team in charge of getting the whole thing put together. It's important to note that these creatures were not Disney's audio animatronic figures. This ride predated the invention of audio animatronics, which debuted inside Walt Disney's Enchanted Tiki Room in 1963. Actually, these figures were more in line with the simple animation created for the Jungle Cruise just 4 years prior. The animation was triggered when a vehicle crossed the path of an infrared beam, and very simple repetitive programs made the electronic valves permit high-pressure air in or out of an actuator cylinder. In other words, the animals didn't do very much. The whole ride was designed to last approximately 8 minutes if things ran smoothly, and if the attraction was running efficiently, it had a capacity of about 1,400 guests per hour when all 8 submarines were in use. Interestingly, the loading dock was designed so cast members could load 3 submarines at the same time. The lagoon was decorated with hand-sculpted rock and colorful artificial plants, which were assembled and stored behind Tomorrowland near the Grand Canyon diorama. When it was time to fill up the lagoon, it took 9 million gallons of chlorinated water to do so. The submarine voyage through liquid space opened along with the Matterhorn bobsleds and the Disneyland Alweg monorail on June 14, 1959. And like the other 2 attractions, it became the first e-ticket ride. The term e-ticket became synonymous with Disneyland fans as referring to a ride with the most excitement and value. The opening day ceremonies included the performances of 10 mermaids in the lagoon, a ribbon cutting, and a christening of the submarine Nautilus by Mildred Nelson, wife of Stuart Nelson, who was the chief machinist aboard the USS Nautilus submarine. Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands was one of the first passengers to ride on opening day. Walt was proud of his Disneyland submarine fleet, and it was the 8th largest in the world, and to this day is the world's largest privately owned fleet. The 8 vessels were named Nautilus, Seawolf, Skate, Skipjack, Triton, George Washington, Patrick Henry, and Ethan Allen. The journey aboard the subs traversed 1,635 feet of track at about 2 miles per hour, seeing a coral reef, then diving deep below the polar ice caps, and then venturing into the submerged world of the lost island of Atlantis, before coming face to face with a large, goofy-looking sea serpent. Many people like to talk about the live mermaids that swam in the lagoon back in the day, and it's true. For the first season of operation, live mermaids swam in the lagoon and were reintroduced in 1965 for Disneyland's Tencennial, where they continued to swim in the lagoon each summer until 1967, when complications required them to stop the practice. Yes, it's true a few men were caught trying to swim out to them, but in reality, the biggest issue was the massive amounts of chlorine and sunlight the women were subjected to in those long summer hours. The attraction was much loved, and in 1962, it received a major overhaul led by Imagineer Mark Davis that included repairs to the lagoon and sprucing up of the overall ride, creating additional sets and scenery and hiding things the guests were never meant to see. The submarine voyage continued to operate the same for several decades, when in 1987, during a routine overhaul, it was decided to repaint the submarines and give a few of them new names. Instead of representing nuclear-powered war vessels, they were painted yellow to represent research submarines. It was around this time that the submarine voyage began to decline in popularity, and to make matters worse, the attraction was extremely costly to maintain. The lagoon was made of concrete and requires constant repairs of cracks and fissures that allow water to leak out. The cleaning of the lagoon and repairs to the animatronics and fake plants had to be done by divers. And when the lagoon needed to be drained, it's not like they could just pull the drain plug. They had to hire a fleet of tank trucks to haul the water off property. So, when it came time to overhaul Tomorrowland for its 1998 reopening, the company had to decide whether to keep the attraction or replace it. Imagineer Tony Baxter had tried to come up with ideas to retheme the ride, but the company was reluctant to invest any more money in the attraction. The answer was no. Baxter requested to at least leave the attraction where it is, in case they could do something with it in the future, and the company agreed. The attraction was given a small decommission ceremony in the early morning hours of September 7, 1998, where the American flag was lowered and ceremoniously folded and handed to Donald Duck. You could say Tony Baxter had single-handedly saved the attraction from demise, but there was still work ahead. Imagineering would need to find a new purpose for Walt's submarine fleet. In the year 2003, the answer had almost come to them. Plans were beginning to gain momentum to theme the attraction to fit with the animated film Atlantis: The Lost Empire, but the company was reluctant due to the disappointing numbers at the box office. Instead, the answer for a retheme came in the form of a tiny little fish named Nemo. The decision was final. The abandoned submarine voyage would be rethemed to the Finding Nemo Submarine Voyage. In 2006, the lagoon was drained yet again for major repairs, scenery reconstruction, and new extensions to the show building. The sets of the ride were prefabricated at Walt Disney Imagineering in Glendale, then shipped to Disneyland to be installed. A new technique of tapping colored glass beads into the paintwork allowed for the props and set pieces to retain their vibrant color much longer than previously possible. The rockwork entrance to the show building was extended further into the lagoon to allow for more dark ride scenes, and carefully positioned projectors and screens allowed Imagineers to add characters from the movie directly into the newly designed set pieces. Much of the original props and sets from the former ride were reused in the rethemed version. Often, these animatronics and sets were simply repainted or rearranged. The submarines themselves had their diesel-electric propulsion system completely replaced with battery-powered motors, which could be recharged by plugging them into the charge ports at the dock. New music, dialogue, and sound effects were programmed into the submarines. However, the method of soundtrack control in 2007 was the same as it was in 1959. You see, as the ride vehicle entered a block zone within the show building, a clock counted down so the operator knew when to start the next segment of narration, and how much time they had to get the submarine to the next block zone. All of the signaling systems and countdown clocks are located above the waterline, completely out of view of the guests since they are peeking out of their portholes below the waterline. The attraction opened June 11, 2007 to huge praise by Disneyland fans and new guests alike. For a decade, the attraction garnered 2-hour wait times, though that might have something to do with the attraction's poor capacity capabilities. While it's true that by removing the diesel engine from the vehicle, they were able to add 2 more seats, the problem is that guests today aren't in as much of a hurry to be seated as previous generations were. This slowed operations down. The ride would be lucky if its capacity reached 1,000 guests per hour with all 8 submarines running. And to further complicate things, in 2007, guests who experienced medical emergencies on the ride had to wait until the vehicle returned to the dock before being removed from the attraction. But there is one major bonus. Any guests with disabilities who cannot climb down the spiral staircase into the submarines can have an alternate experience of the attraction, thanks to a small ADA-compliant room that is themed to the interior of the submarine and offers porthole views of the whole ride. You're probably wondering what a Finding Nemo themed ride is doing in Tomorrowland. What part of it represents the future? And that's a good question. The ride announces that advanced hydrophone technology allows guests to hear what the fish are saying. So there's the ride's connection to the futurism of Tomorrowland. The Finding Nemo Submarine Voyage is still a guest favorite, but due to the costs of maintenance and the large amount of space the attraction takes up, Once in a while, there is rumor floating around that the submarines will sail away into Disneyland history. That being said, there's no reason why it couldn't be replaced with a more modern iteration of a Finding Nemo themed submarine ride, perhaps like the one at Tokyo Disney Sea. Whatever the case, the Finding Nemo Submarine Voyage isn't just a journey below the water, it's a window into the past. A past which is multifaceted and reflects that spirit of adventure once highly sought after by those excited park visitors wielding their e-ticket coupons from their Disneyland ticket book. The submarine voyage through liquid space was a serious look at an experience rarely seen by civilians even to this day. And while parts of it may have frightened us or drew our curiosity towards the deepest parts of the ocean, it left us with a reminder to never take things too seriously and to remember to have fun. For 7 decades, it's been another one of those classic Disneyland attractions that reminds us what it's like to be a kid and to see a world of fun and fantasy lurking in the far depths of our imagination.